Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 5. The Second Ring of Power. The Art of Dreaming. The next day I was by myself all morning. I worked on my notes. In the afternoon I used my car to help Lagorda and the little sisters transport the furniture from Doña Soledad's house to their house. In the early evening Lagorda and I sat in the dining area alone. We were silent for a while. I was very tired. Lagorda broke the silence and said that all of them had been too complacent since the nagual and Genero had left. Each of them had been absorbed in his or her particular tasks. She said that the nagual had commanded her to be an impassionate warrior and to follow whatever path her fate selected for her. If Soledad had stolen my power, Lagorda had to flee and try to save the little sisters, and then join Benigno and Nestor, the only two Generos who would have survived. If the little sisters had killed me, she had to join the Generos, because the little sisters would have had no more need to be with her. If I had not survived the attack of the Allies and she did, she had to leave that area and be on her own. She told me, with a glint in her eye, that she had been sure that neither one of us would survive, and that was why she had said goodbye to her sisters, to her house and to the hills. The nagual told me that in case you and I survived the Allies, she went on, I have to do anything for you, because that would be my warrior's path. That was why I interfered with what Benigno was doing to you last night. He was pressing on your chest with his eyes. That is his art as a stalker. You saw Pablito's hand earlier yesterday. That was also part of the same art. What art is that, Gorda? The art of the stalker. That was the nagual's predilection, and the Generos are his true children at that. We, on the other hand, are dreamers. Your double is dreaming. What she was saying was new to me. I wanted her to elucidate her statements. I paused for a moment to read what I had written in order to select the most appropriate question. I told her that I first wanted to find out what she knew about my double, and then I wanted to know about the art of stalking. The nagual told me that your double is something that takes a lot of power to come out, she said. He figured that you might have enough energy to get it out of you twice. That's why he set up Soledad and the little sisters either to kill you or to help you. Lagorda said that I had had more energy than the nagual thought, and that my double came out 3 times. Apparently Rosa's attack had not been a thoughtless action. On the contrary, she had very cleverly calculated that if she injured me, I would have been helpless. The same ploy Doña Soledad had tried with her dog. I had given Rosa a chance to strike me when I yelled at her, but she failed to injure me. My double came out and injured her instead. Lagorda said that Lydia had told her that Rosa did not want to wake up when all of us had to rush out of Soledad's house, so Lydia squeezed the hand that had been injured. Rosa did not feel any pain and knew in an instant that I had cured her, which meant to them that I had drained my power. Lagorda affirmed that the little sisters were very clever and had planned to drain me of power. To that effect, they had kept on insisting that I cure Soledad. As soon as Rosa realized that I had also cured her, she thought that I had weakened myself beyond repair. All they had to do was to wait for Josefina in order to finish me off. The little sisters didn't know that when you cured Rosa and Soledad you also replenished yourself, Lagorda said, and laughed as if it were a joke. That was why you had enough energy to get your double out a third time when the little sisters tried to take your luminosity. I told her about the vision I had had of Doña Soledad huddled against the wall of her room, and how I had merged that vision with my tactile sense and ended up feeling a viscous substance on her forehead. That was true seeing, Lagorda said. You saw Soledad in her room although she was with me around Gennaro's place, and then you saw your nagual on her forehead. I felt compelled at that point to recount to her the details of my whole experience, especially the realization I had had that I was actually curing Doña Soledad and Rosa by touching the viscous substance, which I felt was part of me. To see that thing on Rosa's hand was also true seeing, she said. And you were absolutely right, that substance was yourself. It came out of your body and it was your nagual. By touching it, you pulled it back. Lagorda told me then, as though she were unveiling a mystery, that the nagual had commanded her not to disclose the fact that since all of us had the same luminosity, if my nagual touched one of them, I would not get weakened, as would ordinarily be the case if my nagual touched an average man. If your nagual touches us, she said, giving me a gentle slap on the head, your luminosity stays on the surface. You can pick it up again and nothing is lost. I told her that the content of her explanation was impossible for me to believe. She shrugged her shoulders as if saying that that was not any of her concern. I asked her then about her usage of the word nagual. I said that Don Juan had explained the nagual to me as being the indescribable principle, the source of everything. Sure, she said smiling. I know what he meant. The nagual is in everything. I pointed out to her, a bit scornfully, that one could also say the opposite, that the tonal is in everything. She carefully explained that there was no opposition, that my statement was correct, the tonal was also in everything. She said that the tonal which is in everything could be easily apprehended by our senses, while the nagual which is in everything manifested itself only to the eye of the sorcerer. She added that we could stumble upon the most outlandish sights of the tonal and be scared of them, or awed by them, or be indifferent to them, because all of us could view those sights. A sight of the nagual, on the other hand, needed the specialized senses of a sorcerer in order to be seen at all. And yet, both the tonal and the nagual were present in everything at all times. It was appropriate, therefore, for a sorcerer to say that looking consisted in viewing the tonal which is in everything, and seeing, on the other hand, consisted in viewing the nagual which also is in everything. Accordingly, if a warrior observed the world as a human being, he was looking, but if he observed it as a sorcerer, he was seeing, and what he was seeing had to be properly called the nagual. She then reiterated the reason, which Nestor had given me earlier, for calling Don Juan the nagual, and confirmed that I was also the nagual because of the shape that came out of my head. I wanted to know why they had called the shape that had come out of my head the double. She said that they had thought they were sharing a private joke with me. They had always called that shape the double, because it was twice the size of the person who had it. Nestor told me that that shape was not such a good thing to have, I said. It's neither good nor bad, she said. You have it and that makes you the nagual. That's all. One of us eight had to be the nagual, and you're the one. It might have been Pablito or me or anyone. Tell me now, what is the art of stalking? I asked. The nagual was a stalker, she said, and peered at me. You must know that. He taught you to stalk from the beginning. It occurred to me that what she was referring to was what Don Juan had called the hunter. He had certainly taught me to be a hunter. I told her that Don Juan had shown me how to hunt and make traps. Her usage of the term stalker, however, was more accurate. A hunter just hunts, she said. A stalker stalks anything, including himself. How does he do that? An impeccable stalker can turn anything into prey. The nagual told me that we can even stalk our own weaknesses. I stopped writing and tried to remember if Don Juan had ever presented me with such a novel possibility. To stalk my weaknesses. I could not recall him ever putting it in those terms. How can one stalk one's weaknesses, Gorda? The same way you stalk prey. You figure out your routines until you know all the doing of your weaknesses, and then you come upon them and pick them up like rabbits inside a cage. Don Juan had taught me the same thing about routines, but in the vein of a general principle that hunters must be aware of. Her understanding and application of it, however, were more pragmatic than mine. Don Juan had said that any habit was, in essence, a doing, and that a doing needed all its parts in order to function. If some parts were missing, a doing was disassembled. By doing, he meant any coherent and meaningful series of actions. In other words, a habit needed all its component actions in order to be a live activity. Gorda then described how she had stalked her own weakness of eating excessively. She said that the nagual had suggested she first tackle the biggest part of that habit, which was connected with her laundry work. She ate whatever her customers fed her, as she went from house to house, delivering her wash. She expected the nagual to tell her what to do, but he only laughed and made fun of her, saying that as soon as he would mention something for her to do, she would fight not to do it. He said that that was the way human beings are. They love to be told what to do, but they love even more to fight and not do what they are told, and thus they get entangled in hating the one who told them in the first place. For many years she could not think of anything to do to stalk her weakness. One day, however, she got so sick and tired of being fat that she refused to eat for 23 days. That was the initial action that broke her fixation. She then had the idea of stuffing her mouth with a sponge to make her customers believe that she had an infected tooth and could not eat. The subterfuge worked not only with her customers, who stopped giving her food, but with her as well, as she had the feeling of eating as she chewed on the sponge. Gorda laughed when she told me how she had walked around with a sponge stuffed in her mouth for years, until her habit of eating excessively had been broken. Was that all you needed to stop your habit? I asked. No. I also had to learn how to eat like a warrior. And how does a warrior eat? A warrior eats quietly, and slowly, and very little at a time. I used to talk while I ate, and I ate very fast, and I ate lots and lots of food at one sitting. The nagual told me that a warrior eats 4 mouthfuls of food at one time. A while later he eats another 4 mouthfuls and so on. A warrior also walks miles and miles every day. My eating weakness never let me walk. I broke it by eating 4 mouthfuls every hour and by walking. Sometimes I walked all day and all night. That was the way I lost the fat on my buttocks. She laughed at her own recollection of the nickname Don Juan had given her. But stalking your weaknesses is not enough to drop them, she said. You can stalk them from now to doomsday, and it won't make a bit of difference. That's why the nagual didn't want to tell me what to do. What a warrior really needs in order to be an impeccable stalker is to have a purpose. Lagorda recounted how she had lived from day to day before she met the nagual, with nothing to look forward to. She had no hopes, no dreams, no desire for anything. The opportunity to eat, however, was always accessible to her. For some reason that she could not fathom, there had been plenty of food available to her every single day of her life. So much of it, in fact, that at one time she weighed 236 pounds. Eating was the only thing I enjoyed in life, Lagorda said. Besides, I never saw myself as being fat. I thought I was rather pretty, and that people liked me as I was. Everyone said that I looked healthy. The nagual told me something very strange. He said that I had an enormous amount of personal power, and due to that I had always managed to get food from friends, while the relatives in my own house were going hungry. Everybody has enough personal power for something. The trick for me was to pull my personal power away from food to my warrior's purpose. And what is that purpose, Gorda? I asked half in jest. To enter into the other world, she replied with a grin and pretended to hit me on top of my head with her knuckles, the way Don Juan used to do when he thought I was indulging. There was no more light for me to write. I wanted her to bring a lantern, but she complained that she was too tired and had to sleep a bit before the little sisters arrived. We went into the front room. She gave me a blanket, then wrapped herself in another one and fell asleep instantly. I sat with my back against a wall. The brick surface of the bed was hard even with 4 straw mats. It was more comfortable to lie down. The moment I did, I fell asleep. I woke up suddenly with an unbearable thirst. I wanted to go to the kitchen to drink some water, but I could not orient myself in the darkness. I could feel Lagorda bundled up in her blanket next to me. I shook her 2 or 3 times and asked her to help me get some water. She grumbled some unintelligible words. She apparently was so sound asleep that she did not want to wake up. I shook her again and suddenly she woke up, only it was not Lagorda. Whoever I was shaking yelled at me in a gruff masculine voice to shut up. There was a man there in place of Lagorda. My fright was instantaneous and uncontrollable. I jumped out of bed and ran for the front door. But my sense of orientation was off and I ended up out in the kitchen. I grabbed a lantern and lit it as fast as I could. Lagorda came out of the outhouse in the back at that moment and asked me if there was something wrong. I nervously told her what had happened. She seemed a bit disoriented herself. Her mouth was open and her eyes had lost their usual sheen. She shook her head vigorously, and that seemed to restore her alertness. She took the lantern and we walked into the front room. There was no one in the bed. Lagorda lit 3 more lanterns. She appeared to be worried. She told me to stay where I was, then she opened the door to their room. I noticed that there was light coming from inside. She closed the door again and said in a matter-of-fact tone not to worry, that it was nothing, and that she was going to make us something to eat. With the speed and efficiency of a short-order cook, she made some food. She also made a hot chocolate drink with cornmeal. We sat across from each other and ate in complete silence. The night was cold. It looked as if it was going to rain. The 3 kerosene lanterns that she had brought to the dining area cast a yellowish light that was very soothing. She took some boards that were stacked up on the floor against a wall and placed them vertically in a deep groove on the transverse supporting beam of the roof. There was a long slit in the floor parallel to the beam that served to hold the boards in place. The result was a portable wall that enclosed the dining area. "Who was in the bed?" I asked. "In bed, next to you, was Josefina. Who else?" She replied as if savoring her words, and then laughed. She's a master at jokes like that. For a moment I thought it was something else, but then I caught the scent that Josefina's body has when she's carrying out one of her pranks. What was she trying to do? Scare me to death? I asked. "You're not their favorite, you know," she replied. "They don't like to be taken out of the path they're familiar with. They hate the fact that Soledad is leaving. They don't want to understand that we are all leaving this area. It looks like our time is up." I knew that today. As I left the house I felt that those barren hills out there were making me tired. I had never felt that way until today. "Where are you going to go?" "I don't know yet. It looks as if that depends on you." "On your power?" "On me? In what way, Gorda?" "Let me explain. The day before you arrived the little sisters and I went to the city. I wanted to find you in the city because I had a very strange vision in my dreaming. In that vision I was in the city with you. I saw you in my vision as plainly as I see you now. You didn't know who I was but you talked to me. I couldn't make out what you said. I went back to the same vision 3 times, but I was not strong enough in my dreaming to find out what you were saying to me. I figured that my vision was telling me that I had to go to the city and trust my power to find you there. I was sure that you were on your way." "Did the little sisters know why you took them to the city?" I asked. "I didn't tell them anything," she replied. "I just took them there. We wandered around the streets all morning." Her statements put me in a very strange frame of mind. Spasms of nervous excitation ran through my entire body. I had to stand up and walk around for a moment. I sat down again and told her that I had been in the city the same day, and that I had wandered around the marketplace all afternoon looking for Don Juan. She stared at me with her mouth open. "We must have passed each other," she said and sighed. "We were in the market and in the park. We sat on the steps of the church most of the afternoon so as not to attract attention to ourselves. The hotel where I had stayed was practically next door to the church. I remembered that I had stood for a long time looking at the people on the steps of the church. Something was pulling me to examine them. I had the absurd notion that both Don Juan and Don Genaro were going to be among those people, sitting like beggars just to surprise me." "When did you leave the city?" I asked. "We left around 5 o'clock and headed for the nagual spot in the mountains," she replied. I had also had the certainty that Don Juan had left at the end of the day. The feelings I had had during that entire episode of looking for Don Juan became very clear to me. In light of what she had told me, I had to revise my stand. I had conveniently explained away the certainty I had had that Don Juan was there in the streets of the city as an irrational expectation, a result of my consistently finding him there in the past. But Lagorda had been in the city actually looking for me, and she was the being closest to Don Juan in temperament. I had felt all along that his presence was there. Lagorda's statement had merely confirmed something that my body knew beyond the shadow of a doubt. I noticed a flutter of nervousness in her body when I told her the details of my mood that day. "What would have happened if you had found me?" I asked. "Everything would have been changed," she replied. "For me to find you would have meant that I had enough power to move forward. That's why I took the little sisters with me. All of us, you, me and the little sisters, would have gone away together that day. Where to, Gorda? Who knows? If I had the power to find you, I would have also had the power to know that. It's your turn now. Perhaps you will have enough power now to know where we should go. Do you see what I mean? I had an attack of profound sadness at that point. I felt more acutely than ever the despair of my human frailty and temporariness. Don Juan had always maintained that the only deterrent to our despair was the awareness of our death, the key to the sorcerer's scheme of things. His idea was that the awareness of our death was the only thing that could give us the strength to withstand the duress and pain of our lives, and our fears of the unknown. But what he could never tell me was how to bring that awareness to the foreground. He had insisted, every time I had asked him, that my volition alone was the deciding factor. In other words, I had to make up my mind to bring that awareness to bear witness to my acts. I thought I had done so. But confronted with Lagorda's determination to find me and go away with me, I realized that if she had found me in the city that day, I would never have returned to my home, never again would I have seen those I held dear. I had not been prepared for that. I had braced myself for dying, but not for disappearing for the rest of my life in full awareness, without anger or disappointment, leaving behind the best of my feelings. I was almost embarrassed to tell Lagorda that I was not a warrior worthy of having the kind of power that must be needed to perform an act of that nature. To leave for good and to know where to go and what to do. We are human creatures, she said. Who knows what's waiting for us or what kind of power we may have? I told her that my sadness in leaving like that was too great. The changes that sorcerers went through were too drastic and too final. I recounted to her what Pablito had told me about his unbearable sadness at having lost his mother. The human form feeds itself on those feelings, she said dryly. I pitied myself and my little children for years. I couldn't understand how the nagual could be so cruel to ask me to do what I did. To leave my children, to destroy them and to forget them. She said that it took her years to understand that the nagual also had had to choose to leave the human form. He was not being cruel. He simply did not have any more human feelings. To him everything was equal. He had accepted his fate. The problem with Pablito, and myself for that matter, was that neither of us had accepted our fate. Lagorda said, in a scornful way, that Pablito wept when he remembered his mother, his Manuelita, especially when he had to cook his own food. She urged me to remember Pablito's mother as she was. An old stupid woman who knew nothing else but to be Pablito's servant. She said that the reason all of them thought he was a coward was because he could not be happy that his servant Manuelita had become the witch Soledad, who could kill him like she would step on a bug. Lagorda stood up dramatically and leaned over the table until her forehead was almost touching mine. The nagual said that Pablito's good fortune was extraordinary, she said. Mother and son fighting for the same thing. If he weren't the coward he is, he would accept his fate and oppose Soledad like a warrior, without fear or hatred. In the end the best would win and take all. If Soledad is the winner, Pablito should be happy with his fate and wish her well. But only a real warrior can feel that kind of happiness. How does Doña Soledad feel about all this? She doesn't indulge in her feelings, Lagorda replied and sat down again. She has accepted her fate more readily than any one of us. Before the nagual helped her, she was worse off than myself. At least I was young, she was an old cow, fat and tired, begging for her death to come. Now death will have to fight to claim her. The time element in Doña Soledad's transformation was a detail that had puzzled me. I told Lagorda that I remembered having seen Doña Soledad no more than 2 years before, and she was the same old lady I had always known. Lagorda said that the last time I had been in Soledad's house, under the impression that it was still Pablito's house, the nagual had set them up to act as if everything were the same. Doña Soledad greeted me, as she always did, from the kitchen, and I really did not face her. Lydia, Rosa, Pablito and Nestor played their roles to perfection in order to keep me from finding out about their true activities. Why would the nagual go to all that trouble, Gorda? He was saving you for something that's not clear yet. He kept you away from every one of us deliberately. He and Genaro told me never to show my face when you were around. Did they tell Josefina the same thing? Yes. She's crazy and can't help herself. She wanted to play her pranks on you. She used to follow you around and you never knew it. One night when the nagual had taken you to the mountains, she nearly pushed you down a ravine in the darkness. The nagual found her in the nick of time. She doesn't do those things out of meanness, but because she enjoys being that way. That's her human form. She'll be that way until she loses it. I've told you that all 6 of them are a bit off. You must be aware of that so as not to be caught in their webs. If you do get caught, don't get angry. They can't help themselves. She was silent for a while. I caught the almost imperceptible sign of a flutter in her body. Her eyes seemed to get out of focus, and her mouth dropped as if the muscles of her jaw had given in. I became engrossed in watching her. She shook her head 2 or 3 times. I've just seen something, she said. You're just like the little sisters in the Generos. She began to laugh quietly. I did not say anything. I wanted her to explain herself without my meddling. Everybody gets angry with you because it hasn't dawned on them yet that you're no different than they are, she went on. They see you as the nagual, and they don't understand that you indulge in your ways just like they do in theirs. She said that Pablito whined and complained and played at being a weakling. Benigno played the shy one, the one who could not even open his eyes. Nestor played to be the wise one, the one who knows everything. Lydia played the tough woman who could crush anyone with a look. Josefina was the crazy one who could not be trusted. Rosa was the bad-tempered girl who ate the mosquitoes that bit her. And I was the fool that came from Los Angeles with a pad of paper and lots of wrong questions. And all of us loved to be the way we were. I was once a fat, smelly woman, she went on after a pause. I didn't mind being kicked around like a dog as long as I was not alone. That was my form. I will have to tell everybody what I have seen about you so they won't feel offended by your acts. I did not know what to say. I felt that she was undeniably right. The important issue for me was not so much her accurateness, but the fact that I had witnessed her arriving at her unquestionable conclusion. How did you see all that? I asked. It just came to me, she replied. How did it come to you? I felt the feeling of seeing coming to the top of my head, and then I knew what I've just told you. I insisted that she describe to me every detail of the feeling of seeing that she was alluding to. She complied after a moment's vacillation, and gave me an account of the same ticklish sensation I had become so aware of during my confrontations with Doña Soledad and the Little Sisters. La Gorda said that the sensation started on the top of her head and then went down her back and around her waist to her womb. She felt it inside her body as a consuming ticklishness, which turned into the knowledge that I was clinging to my human form, like all the rest, except that my particular way was incomprehensible to them. "Did you hear a voice telling you all that?" I asked. "No. I just saw everything I've told you about yourself," she replied. I wanted to ask her if she had had a vision of me clinging to something, but I desisted. I did not want to indulge in my usual behavior. Besides, I knew what she meant when she said that she saw. The same thing had happened to me when I was with Rosa and Lydia. I suddenly knew where they lived. I had not had a vision of their house. I simply felt that I knew it. I asked her if she had also felt a dry sound of a wooden pipe being broken at the base of her neck. "The nagual taught all of us how to get the feeling on top of the head," she said. "But not every one of us can do it. The sound behind the throat is even more difficult. None of us has ever felt it yet. It's strange that you have when you're still empty. How does that sound work?" I asked. "And what is it? You know that better than I do." "What more can I tell you?" she replied in a harsh voice. She seemed to catch herself being impatient. She smiled sheepishly and lowered her head. "I feel stupid telling you what you already know," she said. "Do you ask me questions like that to test if I have really lost my form?" I told her that I was confused, for I had the feeling that I knew what that sound was, and yet it was as if I did not know anything about it, because for me to know something, I actually had to be able to verbalize my knowledge. In this case, I did not even know how to begin verbalizing it. The only thing I could do, therefore, was to ask her questions, hoping that her answers would help me. "I can't help you with that sound," she said. I experienced a sudden and tremendous discomfort. I told her that I was habituated to dealing with Don Juan, and that I needed him then, more than ever, to explain everything to me. "Do you miss the nagual?" she asked. I said that I did, and that I had not realized how much I missed him until I was back again in his homeland. "You miss him because you're still clinging to your human form," she said, and giggled as if she were delighted at my sadness. "Don't you miss him yourself, Gorda?" "No. Not me. I'm him. All my luminosity has been changed. How could I miss something that is myself? How is your luminosity different? A human being, or any other living creature, has a pale yellow glow. Animals are more yellow, humans are more white. But a sorcerer is amber, like clear honey in the sunlight. Some women sorceresses are greenish." The nagual said that those are the most powerful and the most difficult. "What color are you, Gorda?" "Amber, just like you and all the rest of us." That's what the nagual and Genero told me. I've never seen myself. But I've seen everyone else. All of us are amber. And all of us, with the exception of you, are like a tombstone. Average human beings are like eggs. That's why the nagual called them luminous eggs. Sorcerers change not only the color of their luminosity but their shape. We are like tombstones, only we are round at both ends. Am I still shaped like an egg, Gorda? No. You're shaped like a tombstone, except that you have an ugly, dull patch in your middle. As long as you have that patch you won't be able to fly, like sorcerers fly, like I flew last night for you." You won't even be able to drop your human form." I became entangled in a passionate argument, not so much with her as with myself. I insisted that their stand on how to regain that alleged completeness was simply preposterous. I told her that she could not possibly argue successfully with me that one had to turn one's back to one's own children in order to pursue the vaguest of all possible goals. To enter into the world of the nagual. I was so thoroughly convinced that I was right that I got carried away and shouted angry words at her. She was not in any way flustered by my outburst. "Not everybody has to do that," she said. "Only sorcerers who want to enter into the other world. There are plenty of good sorcerers who see and are incomplete. To be complete is only for us Toltecs. Take Soledad, for instance. She's the best witch you can find and she's incomplete. She had 2 children, one of them was a girl. Fortunately for Soledad, her daughter died." The nagual said that the edge of the spirit of a person who dies goes back to the givers, meaning that edge goes back to the parents. If the givers are dead and the person has children, the edge goes to the child who is complete. And if all the children are complete, that edge goes to the one with power, and not necessarily to the best or the most diligent. For example, when Josefina's mother died, the edge went to the craziest of the lot, Josefina. It should have gone to her brother, who is a hardworking, responsible man, but Josefina is more powerful than her brother. Soledad's daughter died without leaving any children, and Soledad got a boost that closed half her hole. Now, the only hope she has to close it completely is for Pablito to die. And by the same token, Pablito's great hope for a boost is for Soledad to die. I told her in very strong terms that what she was saying was disgusting and horrifying to me. She agreed that I was right. She affirmed that at one time she herself had believed that that particular sorcerer's stand was the ugliest thing possible. She looked at me with shining eyes. There was something malicious about her grin. "The nagual told me that you understand everything, but you don't want to do anything about it," she said in a soft voice. I began to argue again. I told her that what the nagual had said about me had nothing to do with my revulsion for the particular stand that we were discussing. I explained that I liked children, that I had the most profound respect for them, and that I empathized very deeply with their helplessness in the awesome world around them. I could not conceive hurting a child in any sense, not for any reason. "The nagual didn't make the rule," she said. "The rule is made somewhere out there, and not by a man." I defended myself by saying that I was not angry with her or the nagual, but that I was arguing in the abstract, because I could not fathom the value of it all. "The value is that we need all our edge, all our power, our completeness in order to enter into that other world," she said. I was a religious woman. I could tell you what I used to repeat without knowing what I meant. I wanted my soul to enter the kingdom of heaven. I still want that, except that I'm on a different path. The world of the nagual is the kingdom of heaven. I objected to her religious connotation on principle. I had become accustomed by Don Juan never to dwell on that subject. She very calmly explained that she saw no difference in terms of lifestyle between us and true nuns and priests. She pointed out that not only were true nuns and priests complete as a rule, but they did not even weaken themselves with sexual acts. The nagual said that that is the reason they will never be exterminated, no matter who tries to exterminate them, she said. Those who are after them are always empty, They don't have the vigor that true nuns and priests have. I like the nagual for saying that. I will always cheer for the nuns and priests. We are alike. We have given up the world and yet we are in the midst of it. Priests and nuns would make great flying sorcerers if someone would tell them that they can do it. The memory of my father's and my grandfather's admiration for the Mexican Revolution came to my mind. They mostly admired the attempt to exterminate the clergy. My father inherited that admiration from his father, and I inherited it from both of them. It was a sort of affiliation that we had. One of the first things that Don Juan undermined in my personality was that affiliation. I once told Don Juan, as if I were voicing my own opinion, something I had heard all my life, that the favorite ploy of the church was to keep us in ignorance. Don Juan had a most serious expression on his face. It was as if my statements had touched a deep fiber in him. I thought immediately of the centuries of exploitation that the Indians had endured. "Those dirty bastards," he said. "They have kept me in ignorance, and you too." I caught his irony tied away and we both laughed. I had never really examined that stand. I did not believe it, but I had nothing else to take its place. I told Don Juan about my grandfather and my father and their views on religion as the liberal men they were. "It doesn't matter what anybody says or does," he said. "You must be an impeccable man yourself. The fight is right here in this chest." He patted my chest gently. "If your grandfather and father would be trying to be impeccable warriors," Don Juan went on, "they wouldn't have time for petty fights. It takes all the time and all the energy we have to conquer the idiocy in us. And that's what matters. The rest is of no importance." Nothing of what your grandfather or father said about the church gave them well-being. To be an impeccable warrior, on the other hand, will give you vigor and youth and power. So, it is proper for you to choose wisely. My choice was the impeccability and simplicity of a warrior's life. Because of that choice I felt that I had to take Lagorda's words in a most serious manner, and that was more threatening to me than even Don Gennaro's acts. He used to frighten me at a most profound level. His actions, although certifying, were assimilated, however, into the coherent continuum of their teachings. Lagorda's words and actions were a different kind of threat to me, somehow more concrete and real than the other. Lagorda's body shivered for a moment. A ripple went through it, making her contract the muscles of her shoulders and arms. She grabbed the edge of the table with an awkward rigidity. Then she relaxed until she was again her usual self. She smiled at me. Her eyes and smile were dazzling. She said in a casual tone that she had just seen my dilemma. "It's useless to close your eyes and pretend that you don't want to do anything or that you don't know anything," she said. "You can do that with people, but not with me. I know now why the nagual commissioned me to tell you all this. I'm a nobody. You admire great people. The nagual and Gennaro were the greatest of all." She stopped and examined me. She seemed to be waiting for my reaction to what she said. "You fought against what the nagual and Gennaro told you, all the way," she went on. "That's why you're behind. And you fought them because they were great. That's your particular way of being. But you can't fight against what I tell you, because you can't look up to me at all. I am your peer, I am in your cycle. You like to fight those who are better than you. It's no challenge to fight my stand. So, those two devils have finally bagged you through me. Poor little nagual, you've lost the game." She came closer to me and whispered in my ear that the nagual had also said that she should never try to take my writing pad away from me, because that would be as dangerous as trying to snatch a bone from a hungry dog's mouth. She put her arms around me, resting her head on my shoulders, and laughed quietly and softly. Her seeing had numbed me. I knew that she was absolutely right. She had pegged me to perfection. She bugged me for a long time with her head against mine. The proximity of her body somehow was very soothing. She was just like Don Juan at that. She exuded strength and conviction and purpose. She was wrong to say that I could not admire her. "Let's forget this," she said suddenly. "Let's talk about what we have to do tonight." "What exactly are we going to do tonight, Gorda?" "We have our last appointment with power." "Is it another dreadful battle with somebody?" "No. The little sisters are simply going to show you something that will complete your visit here. The nagual told me that after that you may go away and never return, or that you may choose to stay with us. Either way, what they have to show you is their art. The art of the dreamer." "And what is that art?" "Genero told me that he tried time and time again to acquaint you with the art of the dreamer. He showed you his other body, his body of dreaming. Once he even made you be in two places at once, but your emptiness did not let you see what he was pointing out to you. It looks as if all his efforts went through the hole in your body. Now it seems that it is different. Genero made the little sisters the dreamers that they are, and tonight they will show you Genero's art. In that respect, the little sisters are the true children of Genero." That reminded me of what Pablito had said earlier, that we were the children of both, and that we were Toltecs. I asked her what he had meant by that. "The nagual told me that sorcerers used to be called Toltecs in his benefactor's language," she replied. "And what language was that, Gorda?" "He never told me. But he and Genero used to speak a language that none of us could understand. And here, between all of us, we understand 4 Indian languages." "Did Don Genero also say that he was a Toltec?" "His benefactor was the same man, so he also said the same thing." From Lagorda's responses I could surmise that she either did not know a great deal on the subject, or she did not want to talk to me about it. I confronted her with my conclusions. She confessed that she had never paid much attention to it, and wondered why I was putting so much value on it. I practically gave her a lecture on the ethnography of central Mexico. "A sorcerer is a Toltec when that sorcerer has received the mysteries of stalking and dreaming," she said casually. "The nagual and Genero received those mysteries from their benefactor, and then they held them in their bodies. We are doing the same, and because of that we are Toltecs like the nagual and Genero. The nagual taught you and me equally to be dispassionate. I am more dispassionate than you because I'm formless. You still have your form and are empty, so you get caught in every snag. One day, however, you'll be complete again and you'll understand then that the nagual was right. He said that the world of people goes up and down, and people go up and down with their world. As sorcerers we have no business following them in their ups and downs. The art of sorcerers is to be outside everything and be unnoticeable. And more than anything else, the art of sorcerers is never to waste their power. The nagual told me that your problem is that you always get caught in idiocies, like what you're doing now. I'm sure that you're going to ask every one of us about the Toltecs, but you're not going to ask any one of us about our attention." Her laughter was clear and contagious. I admitted to her that she was right. Small issues had always fascinated me. I also told her that I was mystified by her usage of the word attention. "I've told you already what the nagual told me about attention," she said. "We hold the images of the world with our attention. A male sorcerer is very difficult to train because his attention is always closed, focused on something. A female, on the other hand, is always open because most of the time she is not focusing her attention on anything. Especially during her menstrual period." The nagual told me and then showed me that during that time I could actually let my attention go from the images of the world. If I don't focus my attention on the world collapses. How is that done, Gorda? It's very simple. When a woman menstruates, she cannot focus her attention. That's the crack the nagual told me about. Instead of fighting to focus, a woman should let go of the images by gazing fixedly at distant hills, or by gazing at water, like a river, or by gazing at the clouds. If you gaze with your eyes open, you get dizzy and the eyes get tired, but if you half close them and blink a lot and move them from mountain to mountain, or from cloud to cloud, you can look for hours or days if necessary. The nagual used to make us sit by the door and gaze at those round hills on the other side of the valley. Sometimes we used to sit there for days until the crack would open. I wanted to hear more about it, but she stopped talking and hurriedly sat very close to me. She signaled me with her hand to listen. I heard a faint swishing sound, and suddenly Lydia stepped out into the kitchen. I thought that she must have been asleep in their room, and the sound of our voices had woken her up. She had changed the Western clothes she had been wearing the last time I had seen her, and had put on a long dress like the Indian women of the area wore. She had a shawl on her shoulders and was barefoot. Her long dress, instead of making her look older and heavier, made her look like a child clad in an older woman's clothes. She walked up to the table and greeted Gorda with a formal "Good evening, Gorda." She then turned to me and said, "Good evening, nagual." Her greeting was so unexpected and her tone so serious that I was about to laugh. I caught a warning from Gorda. She pretended to be scratching the top of her head with the back of her left hand, which was clawed. I answered Lydia the same way Gorda had. "Good evening to you, Lydia." She sat down at the end of the table to the right of me. I did not know whether or not to start up a conversation. I was about to say something when Gorda tapped my leg with her knee, and with a subtle movement of her eyebrows, signaled me to listen. I heard again the muffled sound of a long dress as it touched the floor. Josefina stood for a moment at the door before walking toward the table. She greeted Lydia, Gorda and myself in that order. I could not keep a straight face with her. She was also wearing a long dress, a shawl and no shoes, but in her case, the dress was 3 or 4 sizes larger, and she had put a thick padding into it. Her appearance was thoroughly incongruous. Her face was lean and young, but her body looked grotesquely bloated. She took a bench and placed it at the left end of the table and sat down. All 3 of them looked extremely serious. They were sitting with their legs pressed together and their backs very straight. I heard once more the rustle of a dress and Rosa come out. She was dressed just like the others and was also barefoot. Her greeting was as formal, and the order naturally included Josefina. Everyone answered her in the same formal tone. She sat across the table facing me. All of us remained in absolute silence for quite a while. Gorda spoke suddenly, and the sound of her voice made everyone else jump. She said, pointing to me, that the nagual was going to show them his allies, and that he was going to use his special call to bring them into the room. I tried to make a joke and said that the nagual was not there, so he could not bring any allies. I thought they were going to laugh. Lagorda covered her face, and the little sisters glared at me. Lagorda put her hand on my mouth and whispered in my ear that it was absolutely necessary that I refrain from saying idiotic things. She looked right into my eyes and said that I had to call the allies by making the moth's call. I reluctantly began. But no sooner had I started than the spirit of the occasion took over, and I found that in a matter of seconds, I had given my maximum concentration to producing the sound. I modulated its outflow and controlled the air being expelled from my lungs in order to produce the longest possible tapping. It sounded very melodious. I took an enormous gasp of air to start a new series. I stopped immediately. Something outside the house was answering my call. The tapping sounds came from all around the house, even from the roof. The little sisters stood up and huddled like frightened children around Lagorda and myself. "Please, nagual, don't bring anything into the house," Lydia pleaded with me. Even Lagorda seemed a bit frightened. She gave me a strong command with her hand to stop. I had not intended to keep on producing the sound anyway. The allies, however, either as formless forces or as beings that were prowling outside the door, were not dependent on my tapping sound. I felt again, as I had felt 2 nights before in Don Gennaro's house, an unbearable pressure, a heaviness leaning against the entire house. I could sense it in my navel as an itch, a nervousness that soon turned into sheer physical anguish. The 3 little sisters were beside themselves with fear, especially Lydia and Josefina. Both of them were whining like wounded dogs. All of them surrounded me and then clung to me. Rosa crawled under the table and pushed her head up between my legs. Lagorda stood behind me as calmly as she could. After a few moments, the hysteria and fear of those 3 girls mounted to enormous proportions. Lagorda leaned over and whispered that I should make the opposite sound, the sound that would disperse them. I had a moment of supreme uncertainty. I really did not know any other sound. But then I had a quick sensation of ticklishness on the top of my head, a shiver in my body, and I remembered out of nowhere a peculiar whistling that Don Juan used to perform at night and had endeavored to teach me. He had presented it to me as a means to keep one's balance while walking, so as not to stray away from the trail in the darkness. I began my whistling, and the pressure in my umbilical region ceased. Lagorda smiled and sighed with relief, and the little sisters moved away from my side, giggling as if all of it had been merely a joke. I wanted to indulge in some soul-searching deliberations about the abrupt transition from the rather pleasant exchange I was having with Lagorda to that unearthly situation. For an instant I pondered over whether or not the whole thing was a ploy on their part. But I was too weak. I felt I was about to pass out. My ears were buzzing. The tension around my stomach was so intense that I believed I was going to become ill right there. I rested my head on the edge of the table. After a few minutes, however, I was again relaxed enough to sit up straight. The 3 girls seemed to have forgotten how frightened they had been. In fact, they were laughing and pushing each other as they each tied their shawls around their hips. Lagorda did not seem nervous, nor did she seem relaxed. Rosa was pushed at one moment by the other 2 girls, and fell off the bench where all three of them were sitting. She landed on her seat. I thought that she was going to get furious, but she giggled. I looked at Lagorda for directions. She was sitting with a very straight back. Her eyes were half closed, fixed on Rosa. The little sisters were laughing very loudly, like nervous schoolgirls. Lydia pushed Josefina and sent her tumbling over the bench to fall next to Rosa on the floor. The instant Josefina was on the floor, their laughter stopped. Rosa and Josefina shook their bodies, making an incomprehensible movement with their buttocks. They moved them from side to side, as if they were grinding something against the floor. Then they sprang up like two silent jaguars and took Lydia by the arms. All three of them, without making the slightest noise, spun around a couple of times. Rosa and Josefina lifted Lydia by the armpits and carried her as they tiptoed 2 or 3 times around the table. Then all three of them collapsed as if they had springs on their knees that had contracted at the same time. Their long dresses puffed up, giving them the appearance of huge balls. As soon as they were on the floor, they became even more quiet. There was no other sound except the soft swishing of their dresses as they rolled and crawled. It was as if I were watching a 3-dimensional movie with the sound turned off. Lagorda, who had been quietly sitting next to me watching them, suddenly stood up and with the agility of an acrobat, ran toward the door of their room at the corner of the dining area. Before she reached the door, she tumbled on her right side and shoulder just enough to turn over once, then stood up, pulled by the momentum of her rolling, and flung open the door. She performed all her movements with absolute quietness. The 3 girls rolled and crawled into the room like giant pill bugs. Lagorda signaled me to come over to where she was. We entered the room, and she had me sit on the floor with my back against a frame of the door. She sat to my right with her back also against a frame. She made me interlock my fingers and then placed my hands over my belly button. I was at first forced to divide my attention between Lagorda, the little sisters in the room. But once Lagorda had arranged my sitting position, my attention was taken up by the room. The 3 girls were lying in the middle of a large, white, square room with a brick floor. There were 4 gasoline lanterns, 1 on each wall, placed on built and supporting ledges approximately 6 feet above the ground. The room had no ceiling. The supporting beams of the roof had been darkened, and that gave the effect of an enormous room with no top. The 2 doors were placed on the very corners opposite each other. As I looked at the closed door across from where I was, I noticed that the walls of the room were oriented to follow the cardinal points. The door where we were was at the northwest corner. Rosa, Lydia and Josefina rolled counterclockwise around the room several times. I strained to hear the swish of their dresses, but the silence was absolute. I could only hear Lagorda breathing. The little sisters finally stopped and sat down with their backs against a wall, each under a lantern. Lydia sat at the east wall, Rosa at the north and Josefina at the west. Lagorda stood up, closed the door behind us and secured it with an iron bar. She made me slide over a few inches, without changing my position, until I was sitting with my back against a door. Then she silently rolled the length of the room and sat down underneath the lantern on the south wall. Her getting into that sitting position seemed to be the cue. Lydia stood up and began to walk on the tips of her toes along the edges of the room, close to the walls. It was not a walk proper but rather a soundless sliding. As she increased her speed, she began to move as if she were gliding, stepping on the angle between the floor and the walls. She would jump over Rosa, Josefina, Lagorda and myself every time she got to where we were sitting. I felt her long dress brushing me every time she went by. The faster she ran, the higher she got on the wall. A moment came when Lydia was actually running silently around the four walls of the room 7 or 8 feet above the floor. The sight of her, running perpendicular to the walls, was so unearthly that it bordered on the grotesque. Her long gown made the sight even more eerie. Gravity did not seem to have any effect on Lydia, but it did on her long skirt. It dragged downward. I felt it every time she passed over my head, sweeping my face like a hanging drape. She had captured my attentiveness at a level I could not imagine. The strain of giving her my undivided attention was so great that I began to get stomach convulsions. I felt her running with my stomach. My eyes were getting out of focus. With the last bit of my remaining concentration, I saw Lydia walk down on the east wall diagonally and come to a halt in the middle of the room. She was panting, out of breath, and drenched in perspiration like Lagorda had been after her flying display. She could hardly keep her balance. After a moment she walked to her place at the east wall and collapsed on the floor like a wet rag. I thought she had fainted, but then I noticed that she was deliberately breathing through her mouth. After some minutes of stillness, long enough for Lydia to recover her strength and sit up straight, Rosa stood up and ran without making a sound to the center of the room, turned on her heels, and ran back to where she had been sitting. Her running allowed her to gain the necessary momentum to make an outlandish jump. She leaped up in the air, like a basketball player, along the vertical span of the wall, and her hands went beyond the height of the wall, which was perhaps 10 feet. I saw her body actually hitting the wall, although there was no corresponding crashing sound. I expected her to rebound to the floor with the force of the impact, but she remained hanging there, attached to the wall like a pendulum. From where I sat, it looked as if she were holding a hook of some sort in her left hand. She swayed silently in a pendulum-like motion for a moment, and then catapulted herself 3 or 4 feet over to her left by pushing her body away from the wall with her right arm, at the moment in which her swing was the widest. She repeated the swaying and catapulting 30 or 40 times. She went around the whole room, and then she went up to the beams of the roof where she dangled precariously, hanging from an invisible hook. While she was on the beams, I became aware that what I had thought was a hook in her left hand was actually some quality of that hand that made it possible for her to suspend her weight from it. It was the same hand she had attacked me with 2 nights before. Her display ended with her dangling from the beams over the very center of the room. Suddenly she let go. She fell down from a height of 15 or 16 feet. Her long dress flowed upward and gathered around her head. For an instant, before she landed without a sound, she looked like an umbrella turned inside out by the force of the wind. Her thin, naked body looked like a stick attached to the dark mass of her dress. My body felt the impact of her plummeting down, perhaps more than she did herself. She landed in a squat position and remained motionless, trying to catch her breath. I was sprawled out on the floor with painful cramps in my stomach. Lagorda rolled across the room, took her shawl and tied it around my umbilical region, like a band, looping it around my body 2 or 3 times. She rolled back to the south wall like a shadow. While she had been arranging the shawl around my waist, I had lost sight of Rosa. When I looked up, she was again sitting by the north wall. A moment later, Josefina quietly moved to the center of the room. She paced back and forth with noiseless steps between where Lydia was sitting and her own spot at the west wall. She faced me all the time. Suddenly, as she approached her spot, she raised her left forearm and placed it right in front of her face, as if she wanted to block me from her view. She hid half of her face for an instant behind her forearm. She lowered it and raised it again, that time hiding her entire face. She repeated the movement of lowering and raising her left forearm countless times, as she paced soundlessly from one side of the room to the other. Every time she raised her forearm, a bigger portion of her body disappeared from my view. A moment came when she had hidden her entire body, puffed up with clothes, behind her thin forearm. It was as if by blocking her view of my body, sitting 10 to 12 feet away from her, a thing she could have easily done with the width of her forearm, she also made me block the view of her body, a thing which could not possibly be done with just a width of her forearm. Once she had hidden her entire body, all I was able to make out was a silhouette of a forearm suspended in mid-air, bouncing from one side of the room to the other, and at one point I could hardly see the arm itself. I felt a revulsion, an unbearable nausea. The bouncing forearm depleted me of energy. I slid down on my side, unable to keep my balance. I saw the arm falling to the ground. Josefina was lying on the floor covered with garments, as if her puffed-up clothes had exploded. She lay on her back with her arms spread out. It took a long time to get back my physical balance. My clothes were soaked in perspiration. I was not the only one affected. All of them were exhausted and drenched in sweat. LaGorda was the most poised, but her control seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. I could hear all of them, including LaGorda, breathing through their mouths. When I was in full control again, everybody sat on her spot. The little sisters were looking at me fixedly. I saw out of the corner of my eye that LaGorda's eyes were half closed. She suddenly rolled noiselessly to my side and whispered in my ear that I should begin to make my moth call, keeping it up until the Allies had rushed into the house and were about to take us. I had a moment of vacillation. She whispered that there was no way to change directions, and that we had to finish what we had started. After untying her shawl from my waist, she rolled back to her spot and sat down. I put my left hand to my lips and tried to produce the tap-ping sound. I found it very difficult at first. My lips were dry and my hands were sweaty, but after an initial clumsiness, a feeling of vigor and well-being came over me. I produced the most flawless tapping noise I had ever done. It reminded me of the tapping noise I had been hearing all along as a response to mine. As soon as I stopped to breathe, I could hear the tapping sound being answered from all directions. LaGorda signaled me to go on with it. I produced 3 more series. The last one was utterly mesmeric. I did not need to intake a gulp of air and let it out in small spurts, as I had been doing all along. This time the tapping sound came out of my mouth freely. I did not even have to use the edge of my hand to produce it. LaGorda suddenly rushed to me, lifted me up bodily by my armpits, and pushed me to the middle of the room. Her action disrupted my absolute concentration. I noticed that Lydia was holding onto my right arm, Josefina to my left, and Rosa had backed up against the front of me and was holding me by the waist with her arms extended backward. LaGorda was in back of me. She ordered me to put my arms behind and grab onto her shawl, which she had looped around her neck and shoulders like a harness. I noticed at that moment that something besides us was there in the room, but I could not tell what it was. The little sisters were shivering. I knew that they were aware of something which I was unable to distinguish. I also knew that LaGorda was going to try to do what she had done in Don Gennaro's house. All of a sudden, I felt the wind of the door pulling us. I grabbed onto LaGorda's shawl with all my strength while the little sisters grabbed onto me. I felt that we were spinning, tumbling and swaying from side to side like a giant weightless leaf. I opened my eyes and saw that we were like a bundle. We were either standing up or we were lying horizontally in the air. I could not tell which because I had no sensorial point of reference. Then, as suddenly as we had been lifted off, we were dropped. I sensed our falling in my midsection. I yelled with pain, and my screams were united with those of the little sisters. The insides of my knees hurt. I felt an unbearable jolt on my legs. I thought I must have broken them. My next impression was that something was getting inside my nose. It was very dark and I was lying on my back. I sat up. I realized then that LaGorda was tickling my nostrils with a twig. I did not feel exhausted or even mildly tired. I jumped to my feet and only then was I stricken by the realization that we were not in the house. We were on a hill, a rocky, barren hill. I took a step and nearly fell down. I had stumbled over a body. It was Josefina. She was extremely hot to the touch. She seemed to be feverish. I tried to make her sit up, but she was limp. Rosa was next to her. As a contrast, her body was icy cold. I put one on top of the other and rocked them. That motion brought them back to their senses. LaGorda had found Lydia and was making her walk. After a few minutes, all of us were standing. We were perhaps half a mile east of the house. Years before, Don Juan had produced in me a similar experience, but with the aid of a psychotropic plant. He seemingly made me fly and I landed a distance from his house. At the time, I had tried to explain the event in rational terms, but there was no ground for rational explanations, and, short of accepting that I had flown, I had to fall back onto the only two avenues left open. I could explain it all by arguing that Don Juan had transported me to the distant field while I was still unconscious under the effect of the psychotropic alkaloids of that plant, or by arguing that under the influence of the alkaloids, I had believed what Don Juan was ordering me to believe, that I was flying. This time I had no other recourse but to brace myself for accepting, on its face value, that I had flown. I wanted to indulge in doubts and began to wonder about the possibilities of the four girls carrying me to that hill. I laughed loudly, incapable of containing an obscure delight. I was having a relapse of my old malady. My reason, which had been blocked off temporarily, was beginning to take hold of me again. I wanted to defend it. Or perhaps it would be more appropriate to say, in light of the outlandish acts I had witnessed and performed since my arrival, that my reason was defending itself, independently of the more complex whole that seemed to be the me I did not know. I was witnessing, almost in the fashion of an interested observer, how my reason struggled to find suitable rationales, while another, much larger portion of me could not have cared less about explaining anything. LaGorda made the three girls line up. She then pulled me to her side. All of them folded their arms behind their backs. Lagorda made me do the same. She stretched my arms as far back as they would go, and then made me bend them and grab each forearm as tightly as possible, as close to the elbows as I could. That created a great muscular pressure at the articulations of my shoulders. She pushed my trunk forward until I was almost stooping. Then she made a peculiar bird call. That was a signal. Lydia started walking. In the darkness, her movements reminded me of an ice skater. She walked swiftly and silently, and in a few minutes she disappeared from my view. Lagorda made 2 more bird calls, one after the other, and Rosa and Josefina took off in the same manner Lydia had. Lagorda told me to follow close to her. She made 1 more bird call, and we both started walking. I was surprised at the ease with which I walked. My entire balance was centered in my legs. The fact that I had my arms behind my back, instead of hindering my movements, aided me in maintaining a strange equilibrium. But above all, what surprised me the most was the quietness of my steps. When we reached the road, we began to walk normally. We passed 2 men going in the opposite direction. Lagorda greeted them and they answered back. When we arrived at the house, we found the little sisters standing by the door, not daring to go in. Lagorda told them that although I could not control the allies, I could either call them or tell them to leave, and that the allies would not bother us any longer. The girls believed her, something I myself could not do in that instance. We went inside. In a very quiet and efficient manner, all of them undressed, drenched themselves with cold water, and put on a fresh change of clothes. I did the same. I put on the old clothes I used to keep in Don Juan's house, which Lagorda brought to me in a box. All of us were in high spirits. I asked Lagorda to explain to me what we had done. "We'll talk about that later," she said in a firm tone. I remembered then that the packages I had for them were still in the car. I thought that while Lagorda was cooking some food for us, it would be a good opportunity to distribute them. I went out and got them and brought them into the house. I placed them on the table. Lydia asked me if I had already assigned the gifts as she had suggested. I said that I wanted them to pick one they liked. She declined. She said that no doubt I had something special for Pablito and Nestor and a bunch of trinkets for them, which I would throw on the table with the intention that they fight over them. "Besides, you didn't bring anything for Benigno," Lydia said as she came to my side and looked at me with mock seriousness. "You can't hurt the Genero's feelings by giving 2 gifts for 3. They all laughed. I felt embarrassed. She was absolutely right in everything that she had said. "You are careless, that's why I've never liked you," Lydia said to me, changing her smile into a frown. "You have never greeted me with affection or respect. Every time we saw each other, you only pretended to be happy to see me." She imitated my obviously contrived effusive greeting, a greeting I must have given her countless times in the past. "Why didn't you ever ask me what I was doing here?" Lydia asked me. I stopped writing to consider her point. It had never occurred to me to ask her anything. I told her that I had no excuse. Lagorda interceded and said that the reason that I had never said more than 2 words to either Lydia or Rosa each time I saw them was because I was accustomed to talking only to women that I was enamored of, in one way or another. Lagorda added that the nagual had told them that if I would ask them anything directly, they were supposed to answer my questions, but as long as I did not ask, they were not supposed to mention anything. Rosa said that she did not like me because I was always laughing and trying to be funny. Josefina added that since I had never seen her, she disliked me just for fun, for the hell of it. I want you to know that I don't accept you as the nagual, Lydia said to me. You're too dumb. You know nothing. I know more than you do. How can I respect you? Lydia added that as far as she was concerned I could go back where I came from or go jump in a lake for that matter. Rosa and Josefina did not say a word. Judging by the serious and mean expressions on their faces, however, they seemed to agree with Lydia. How can this man lead us? Lydia asked Lagorda. He's not a true nagual. He's a man. He's going to make us into idiots like himself. As she was talking I could see the mean expressions on Rosa's and Josefina's faces getting even harder. Lagorda intervened and explained to them what she had seen earlier about me. She added that since she had recommended to me not to get entangled in their webs, she was recommending the same thing to them, not to get entangled in mine. After Lydia's initial display of genuine and well-founded animosity, I was flabbergasted to see how easily she acquiesced to Lagorda's remarks. She smiled at me. She even came and sat next to me. You're really like us, eh? She asked in a tone of bewilderment. I did not know what to say. I was afraid of blundering. Lydia was obviously the leader of the little sisters. The moment she smiled at me the other two seemed to be infused instantly with the same mood. Lagorda told them not to mind my pencil and paper and my asking questions, and that in return, I would not be flustered when they became involved in doing what they loved the most, to indulge in themselves. The three of them sat close to me. Lagorda walked over to the table, got the packages and took them out to my car. I asked Lydia to forgive me for my inexcusable blunderings of the past, and asked all of them to tell me how they had become Don Juan's apprentices. In order to make them feel at ease, I gave them an account of how I had met Don Juan. Their accounts were the same as what Doña Soledad had already told me. Lydia said that all of them had been free to leave Don Juan's world, but their choice had been to stay. She, in particular, being the first apprentice, was given an opportunity to go away. After the nagual in Genero had cured her, the nagual had pointed to the door and told her that if she did not go through it then, the door would close her in and would never open again. My fate was sealed when that door closed, Lydia said to me. Just like what happened to you. The nagual told me that after he had put a patch on you, you had a chance to leave, but you didn't want to take it. I remembered that particular decision more vividly than anything else. I recounted to them how Don Juan had tricked me into believing that a sorceress was after him, and then he gave me the choice of either leaving for good or staying to help him wage a war against his attacker. It turned out that his alleged attacker was one of his confederates. By confronting her, on what I thought was Don Juan's behalf, I turned her against me, and she became what he called my worthy opponent. I asked Lydia if they had had a worthy opponent themselves. We are not as dumb as you are, she said. We never needed anyone to spur us. Pablito is that dumb, Rosa said. Soledad is his opponent. I don't know how worthy she is, though. But as the saying goes, if you can't feed on a capon, feed on an onion. They laughed and banged on the table. I asked them if any of them knew the sorceress Don Juan had pitted me against, La Catalina. They shook their heads negatively. I know her, Lagorda said from the stove. She's from the nagual's cycle, But she looks as if she's 30. What is a cycle, Gorda? I asked. She walked over to the table and put her foot on the bench and rested her chin on her arm and knee. Sorcerers like the nagual and Genero have 2 cycles, she said. The first is when they're human, like ourselves. We are in our first cycle. Each of us has been given a task, and that task is making us leave the human form. Eligio, the 5 of us, and the Generos are of the same cycle. The second cycle is when a sorcerer is not human anymore, like the nagual and Genero. They came to teach us, and after they taught us they left. We are the second cycle to them. The nagual and La Catalina are like you and Lydia. They are in the same positions. She's a scary sorceress, just like Lydia. Lagorda went back to the stove. The little sisters seemed nervous. That must be the woman who knows power plants, Lydia said to Lagorda. Lagorda said that she was the one. I asked them if the nagual had ever given them power plants. No, not to us 3, Lydia replied. Power plants are given only to empty people. Like yourself and Lagorda. Did the nagual give you power plants, Gorda? I asked loudly. Lagorda raised 2 fingers over her head. The nagual gave her his pipe twice, Lydia said. And she went off her rocker both times. What happened, Gorda? I asked. I went off my rocker, she said as she walked over to the table. Power plants were given to use because the nagual was putting a patch on our bodies. Mine hooked fast, but yours was difficult. The nagual said that you were crazier than Josefina and impossible like Lydia, and he had to give you a lot of them. Lagorda explained that power plants were used only by sorcerers who had mastered their art. Those plants were such a powerful affair that in order to be properly handled, the most impeccable attention was needed on the part of the sorcerer. It took a lifetime to train one's attention to the degree needed. Lagorda said that complete people do not need power plants, and that neither the little sisters nor the Generos had ever taken them, but that someday when they had perfected their art as dreamers, they would use them to get a final and total boost, a boost of such magnitude that it would be impossible for us to understand. Would you and I take them too? I asked Lagorda. All of us, she replied. The nagual said that you should understand this point better than any of us. I considered the issue for a moment. The effect of psychotropic plants had indeed been terrifying for me. They seemed to reach a vast reservoir in me and extract from it a total world. The drawback in taking them had been the toll they took on my physical well-being and the impossibility of controlling their effect. The world they plunged me into was unamenable and chaotic. I lacked the control, the power, in Don Juan's terms, to make use of such a world. If I would have the control, however, the possibilities would be staggering to the mind. I took them, myself, Josefina said all of a sudden. When I was crazy, the nagual gave me his pipe to cure me or kill me. And it cured me. The nagual really gave Josefina his smoke, Lagorda said from the stove, and then came over to the table. He knew that she was pretending to be crazier than she was. She's always been a bit off, and she's very daring and indulges in herself like no one else. She always wanted to live where nobody would bother her, and she could do whatever she wanted. So the nagual gave her his smoke and took her to live in a world of her liking for 14 days, until she was so bored with it that she got cured. She cut her indulging. That was her cure. Lagorda went back to the stove. The little sisters laughed and patted one another on the back. I remembered then that at Doña Soledad's house, Lydia had not only intimated that Don Juan had left a package for me, but she had actually shown me a bundle that had made me think of the sheath in which Don Juan used to keep his pipe. I reminded Lydia that she had said that they would give me that package when La Gorda was present. The little sisters looked at one another and then turned to La Gorda. She made a gesture with her head. Josefina stood up and went to the front room. She returned a moment later with the bundle that Lydia had shown me. I had a pang of anticipation in the pit of my stomach. Josefina carefully placed the bundle on the table in front of me. All of them gathered around. She began to untie it as ceremoniously as Lydia had done the first time. When the package was completely unwrapped, she spilled the contents on the table. They were menstruation rags. I got flustered for an instant. But the sound of La Gorda's laughter, which was louder than the others, was so pleasing that I had to laugh myself. "That's Josefina's personal bundle," La Gorda said. "It was her brilliant idea to play on your greed for a gift from the nagual, in order to make you stay. You have to admit that it was a good idea," Lydia said to me. She imitated the look of greed I had on my face when she was opening the package, and then my look of disappointment when she did not finish. I told Josefina that her idea had indeed been brilliant, that it had worked as she had anticipated, and that I had wanted that package more than I would care to admit. "You can have it, if you want it," Josefina said, and made everybody laugh. La Gorda said that the nagual had known from the beginning that Josefina was not really ill, and that was the reason it had been so difficult for him to cure her. People who are actually sick are more pliable. Josefina was too aware of everything and very unruly, and he had had to smoke her a great many times. Don Juan had once said the same thing about me, that he had smoked me. I had always believed that he was referring to having used psychotropic mushrooms to have a view of me. "How did he smoke you?" I asked Josefina. She shrugged her shoulders and did not answer. "The same way he smoked you," Lydia said. "He pulled your luminosity and dried it with the smoke from a fire that he had made." I was sure that Don Juan had never explained such a thing to me. I asked Lydia to tell me what she knew about the subject. She turned to La Gorda. "Smoke is very important for sorcerers," La Gorda said. "Smoke is like fog. Fog is of course better, but it's too hard to handle. It's not as handy as smoke is. So if a sorcerer wants to see and know someone who is always hiding, like you and Josefina, who are capricious and difficult, the sorcerer makes a fire and lets the smoke envelop the person. Whatever they're hiding comes out in the smoke." La Gorda said that the nagual used smoke not only to see and know people, but also to cure. He gave Josefina smoke baths. He made her stand or sit by the fire in the direction the wind was blowing. The smoke would envelop her and make her choke and cry, but her discomfort was only temporary and of no consequence. The positive effects, on the other hand, were a gradual cleansing of the luminosity. "The nagual gave all of us smoke baths," La Gorda said. "He gave you even more baths than Josefina. He said that you were unbearable, and you were not even pretending, like she was. It all became clear to me. She was right. Don Juan had made me sit in front of a fire hundreds of times. The smoke used to irritate my throat and eyes to such a degree that I dreaded to see him begin to gather dry twigs and branches. He said that I had to learn to control my breathing and feel the smoke while I kept my eyes closed, that way I could breathe without choking. LaGorda said that smoke had helped Josefina to be ethereal and very elusive, and that no doubt it had helped me to cure my madness, whatever it was. The nagual said that smoke takes everything out of you, LaGorda went on. It makes you clear and direct. I asked her if she knew how to bring out with the smoke whatever a person was hiding. She said that she could easily do it because of having lost her form, but that the little sisters and the generos, although they had seen the nagual and genero do it scores of times, could not yet do it themselves. I was curious to know why Don Juan had never mentioned the subject to me, in spite of the fact that he had smoked me like dry fish hundreds of times. He did, LaGorda said with her usual conviction. The nagual even taught you fog gazing. He told us that once you smoked a whole place in the mountains and saw what was hiding behind the scenery. He said that he was spellbound himself. I remembered an exquisite perceptual distortion, a hallucination of sorts, which I had had and thought was the product of a play between a most dense fog and an electrical storm that was occurring at the same time. I narrated to them the episode and added that Don Juan had never really directly taught me anything about the fog or the smoke. His procedure had been to build fires or to take me into fog banks. LaGorda did not say a word. She stood up and went back to the stove. Lydia shook her head and clicked her tongue. You sure are dumb, she said. The nagual taught you everything. How do you think you saw what you have just told us about? There was an abyss between our understanding of how to teach something. I told them that if I were to teach them something I knew, such as how to drive a car, I would go step by step, making sure that they understood every facet of the whole procedure. LaGorda returned to the table. That's only if the sorcerer is teaching something about the tonal, she said. When the sorcerer is dealing with the nagual, he must give the instruction, which is to show the mystery to the warrior. And that's all he has to do. The warrior who receives the mysteries must claim knowledge as power by doing what he has been shown. The nagual showed you more mysteries than all of us together. But you're lazy, like Pablito, and prefer to be confused. The tonal and the nagual are two different worlds. In one you talk, in the other you act. At the moment she spoke, her words made absolute sense to me. I knew what she was talking about. She went back to the stove, stirred something in a pot and came back again. Why are you so dumb? Lydia bluntly asked me. He's empty, Rosa replied. They made me stand up and forced themselves to squint as they scanned my body with their eyes. All of them touched my umbilical region. But why are you still empty? Lydia asked. You know what to do, don't you? Rosa added. He was crazy, Josefina said to them. He must still be crazy now. LaGorda came to my aid and told them that I was still empty for the same reason they still had their form. All of us secretly did not want the world of the nagual. We were afraid and had second thoughts. In short, none of us was better than Pablito. They did not say a word. All three of them seemed thoroughly embarrassed. Poor little nagual, Lydia said to me with a tone of genuine concern. You're as scared as we are. I pretend to be tough, Josefina pretends to be crazy, Rosa pretends to be ill-tempered, and you pretend to be dumb. They laughed, and for the first time since I had arrived they made a gesture of comradeship toward me. They embraced me and put their heads against mine. Lagorda sat facing me, and the little sisters sat around her. I was facing all four of them. "Now we can talk about what happened tonight," Lagorda said. "The nagual told me that if we survived the last contact with the Allies we wouldn't be the same. The Allies did something to us tonight. They have hurled us away." She gently touched my writing hand. "Tonight was a special night for you," she went on. "Tonight all of us pitched in to help you, including the Allies. The nagual would have liked it. Tonight you saw all the way through." "I did?" I asked. "There you go again," Lydia said, and everybody laughed. "Tell me about my seeing, Gorda," I insisted. "You know that I'm dumb." "There should be no misunderstandings between us." "All right," she said. "I see what you mean. Tonight you saw the little sisters. I said to them that I had also witnessed incredible acts performed by Don Juan and Don Gennaro. I had seen them as plainly as I had seen the little sisters, and yet Don Juan and Don Gennaro had always concluded that I had not seen. I failed, therefore, to determine in what way could the acts of the little sisters be different." "You mean you didn't see how they were holding onto the lines of the world?" she asked. "No, I didn't." "You didn't see them slipping through the crack between the worlds?" I narrated to them what I had witnessed. They listened in silence. At the end of my account, Lagorda seemed to be on the verge of tears. "What a pity!" she exclaimed. She stood up and walked around the table and embraced me. Her eyes were clear and restful. I knew she bore no malice toward me. "It's our fate that you are plugged up like this," she said. "But you're still the nagual to us. I won't hinder you with ugly thoughts. You can at least be assured of that." I knew that she meant it. She was speaking to me from a level that I had witnessed only in Don Juan. She had repeatedly explained her mood as the product of having lost her human form. She was indeed a formless warrior. A wave of profound affection for her enveloped me. I was about to weep. It was at the instant that I felt she was a most marvelous warrior that quite an intriguing thing happened to me. The closest way of describing it would be to say that I felt that my ears had suddenly popped. Except that I felt the popping in the middle of my body, right below my navel, more acutely than in my ears. Right after the popping everything became clearer: sounds, sights, odors. Then I felt an intense buzzing, which oddly enough did not interfere with my hearing capacity. The buzzing was loud, but did not drown out any other sounds. It was as if I were hearing the buzzing with some part of me other than my ears. A hot flash went through my body. And then I suddenly recalled something I had never seen. It was as though an alien memory had taken possession of me. I remembered Lydia pulling herself from two horizontal, reddish ropes as she walked on the wall. She was not really walking. She was actually gliding on a thick bundle of lines that she held with her feet. I remembered seeing her panting with her mouth open from the exertion of pulling the reddish ropes. The reason I could not hold my balance at the end of her display was because I was seeing her as a light that went around a room so fast that it made me dizzy. It pulled me from the area around my navel. I remembered Rosa's actions and Josefina's as well. Rosa had actually brachiated, with her left arm holding onto long, vertical, reddish fibers that looked like vines dropping from the dark roof. With her right arm she was also holding some vertical fibers that seemed to give her stability. She also held onto the same fibers with her toes. Toward the end of her display she was like a phosphorescence on the roof. The lines of her body had been erased. Josefina was hiding herself behind some lines that seemed to come out of the floor. What she was doing with her raised forearm was moving the lines together to give them the necessary width to conceal her bulk. Her puffed-up clothes were a great prop. They had somehow contracted her luminosity. The clothes were bulky only for the eye that looked. At the end of her display, Josefina, like Lydia and Rosa, was just a patch of light. I could switch from one recollection to the other in my mind. When I told them about my concurrent memories, the little sisters looked at me bewildered. LaGorda was the only one who seemed to be following what was happening to me. She laughed with true delight and said that the nagual was right in saying that I was too lazy to remember what I had seen, therefore, I only bothered with what I had looked at. Is it possible, I thought to myself, that I am unconsciously selecting what I recall? Or is it LaGorda who is creating all this? If it was true that I had selected my recall at first and then released what I had censored, then it also had to be true that I must have perceived much more of Don Juan's and Don Gennaro's actions, and yet I could only recall a selective part of my total perception of those events. It's hard to believe, I said to LaGorda, that I can remember now something I didn't remember at all a while ago. The nagual said that everyone can see, and yet we choose not to remember what we see, she said. Now I understand how right he was. All of us can see, some, more than others. I told LaGorda that some part of me knew that I had found then a transcendental key. A missing piece had been handed down to me by all of them. But it was difficult to discern what it was. She announced that she had just seen that I had practiced a good deal of dreaming, and that I had developed my attention, and yet I was fooled by my own appearance of not knowing anything. I've been trying to tell you about attention, she proceeded, but you know as much as we do about it. I assured her that my knowledge was intrinsically different from theirs. Theirs was infinitely more spectacular than mine. Anything they might say to me in relation to their practices, therefore, was a bonus to me. The nagual told us to show you that with our attention we can hold the images of a dream in the same way we hold the images of the world, LaGorda said. The art of the dreamer is the art of attention. Thoughts came down on me like a landslide. I had to stand up and walk around the kitchen. I sat down again. We remained quiet for a long time. I knew what she had meant when she said that the art of dreamers was the art of attention. I knew then that Don Juan had told me and showed me everything he could. I had not been able, however, to realize the premises of his knowledge in my body while he was around. He had said that my reason was the demon that kept me chained, and that I had to vanquish it if I wanted to achieve the realization of his teachings. The issue, therefore, had been how to vanquish my reason. It had never occurred to me to press him for a definition of what he meant by reason. I presumed all along that he meant the capacity for comprehending, inferring or thinking, in an orderly, rational way. From what LaGorda had said, I knew that to him reason meant attention. Don Juan said that the core of our being was the act of perceiving, and that the magic of our being was the act of awareness. For him, perception and awareness were a single functional, inextricable unit, a unit which had two domains. The first one was the attention of the tonal, that is to say, the capacity of average people to perceive and place their awareness on the ordinary world of everyday life. Don Juan also called this form of attention our first ring of power, and described it as our awesome, but taken for granted ability to impart order to our perception of our daily world. The second domain was the attention of the nagual, that is to say, the capacity of sorcerers to place their awareness on the non-ordinary world. He called this domain of attention the second ring of power, or the altogether portentous ability that all of us have, but only sorcerers use, to impart order to the non-ordinary world. Lagorda and the Little Sisters, in demonstrating to me that the art of dreamers was to hold the images of their dreams with their attention, had broadened the pragmatic aspect of Don Juan's scheme. They were the practitioners who had gone beyond the theoretical aspect of his teachings. In order to give me a demonstration of that art, they had to make use of their second ring of power, or the attention of the nagual. In order for me to witness their art, I had to do the same. In fact, it was evident that I had placed my attention on both domains. Perhaps all of us are continually perceiving in both fashions, but choose to isolate one for recollection and discard the other, or perhaps we file it away, as I myself had done. Under certain conditions of stress or acquiescence, the censored memory surfaces and we can then have two distinct memories of one event. What Don Juan had struggled to vanquish, or rather suppress in me, was not my reason as the capacity for rational thought, but my attention of the tonal, or my awareness of the world of common sense. His motive for wanting me to do so was explained by Lagorda when she said that the daily world exists because we know how to hold its images. Consequently, if one drops the attention needed to maintain those images, the world collapses. The nagual told us that practice is what counts, Lagorda said suddenly. Once you get your attention on the images of your dream, your attention is hooked for good. In the end, you can be like Gennaro, who could hold the images of any dream. We each have 5 other dreams, Lydia said. But we showed you the first one because that was the dream the nagual gave us. Can all of you go into dreaming anytime you want? I asked. No, Lagorda replied. Dreaming takes too much power. None of us has that much power. The reason the Little Sisters had to roll on the floor so many times was that enrolling the earth was giving them energy. Maybe you could also remember seeing them as luminous beings getting energy from the light of the earth. The nagual said that the best way of getting energy is, of course, to let the sun inside the eyes, especially the left eye. I told her that I knew nothing about it, and she described a procedure that Don Juan had taught them. As she spoke, I remembered that Don Juan had also taught the same procedure to me. It consisted in moving my head slowly from side to side as I caught the sunlight with my half-closed left eye. He said that one could not only use the sun, but could use any kind of light that could shine on the eyes. Lagorda said that the nagual had recommended that they tie their shawls below their waists in order to protect their hip bones when they rolled. I commented that Don Juan had never mentioned rolling to me. She said that only women could roll because they had wombs and energy came directly into their wombs. By rolling around, they distributed that energy over the rest of their bodies. In order for a man to be energized, he had to be on his back, with his knees bent, so that the soles of his feet touched each other. His arms had to be extended laterally, with his forearms raised vertically, and the fingers clawed in an upright position. We have been dreaming those dreams for years, Lydia said. Those dreams are our best, because our attention is complete. In the other dreams that we have, our attention is still shaky. Lagorda said that holding the images of dreams was a Toltec art. After years of consuming practice, each one of them was able to perform one act in any dream. Lydia could walk on anything, Rosa could dangle from anything, Josephina could hide behind anything, and she herself could fly. But they were only beginners, apprentices of the art. They had complete attention for only one activity. She added that Gennaro was the master of dreaming and could turn the tables around and have attention for as many activities as we have in our daily life, and that for him the two domains of attention had the same value. I felt compelled to ask them my usual question. I had to know their procedures, how they held the images of their dreams. "You know that as well as we do," Lagorta said. "The only thing I can say is that after going to the same dream over and over, we began to feel the lines of the world. They helped us to do what you saw us doing." Don Juan had said that our first ring of power is engaged very early in our lives, and that we live under the impression that that is all there is to us. Our second ring of power, the attention of the nagual, remains hidden for the immense majority of us, and only at the moment of our death is it revealed to us. There is a pathway to reach it, however, which is available to every one of us, but which only sorcerers take, and that pathway is through dreaming. Dreaming was in essence the transformation of ordinary dreams into affairs involving volition. Dreamers, by engaging their attention of the nagual and focusing it on the items and events of their ordinary dreams, change those dreams into dreaming. Don Juan said that there were no procedures to arrive at the attention of the nagual. He only gave me pointers. Finding my hands in my dreams was the first pointer, then the exercise of paying attention was elongated to finding objects, looking for specific features, such as buildings, streets and so on. From there the jump was to dreaming about specific places at specific times of the day. The final stage was drawing the attention of the nagual to focus on the total self. Don Juan said that that final stage was usually ushered in by a dream that many of us have had at one time or another, in which one is looking at oneself sleeping in bed. By the time a sorcerer has had such a dream, his attention has been developed to such a degree that instead of waking himself up, as most of us would do in a similar situation, he turns on his heels and engages himself in activity, as if he were acting in the world of everyday life. From that moment on there is a breakage, a division of sorts in the otherwise unified personality. The result of engaging the attention of the nagual and developing it to the height and sophistication of our daily attention of the world was, in Don Juan's scheme, the other self, an identical being as oneself, but made in dreaming. Don Juan had told me that there are no definite standard steps for teaching that double, as there are no definite steps for us to reach our daily awareness. We simply do it by practicing. He contended that in the act of engaging our attention of the nagual, we would find the steps. He urged me to practice dreaming, without letting my fears make it into an encumbering production. He had done the same with Lagorta and the little sisters, but obviously something in them had made them more receptive to the idea of another level of attention. Gennaro was in his body of dreaming most of the time, Lagorta said. He liked it better. That's why he could do the weirdest things and scare you half to death. Gennaro could go in and out of the crack between the worlds like you, and I can go in and out a door. Don Juan had also talked to me at great length about the crack between the worlds. I had always believed that he was talking in a metaphorical sense about a subtle division between the world that the average man perceives and the world that sorcerers perceive. Lagorta and the little sisters had shown me that the crack between the worlds was more than a metaphor. It was rather the capacity to change levels of attention. One part of me understood Lagorda perfectly, while another part of me was more frightened than ever. "You have been asking where the nagual and Genero went," Lagorda said. "Soledad was very blunt and told you that they went to the other world. Lydia told you they left this area. The Generos were stupid and scared you. The truth is that the nagual and Genero went through that crack." For some reason, undefinable to me, her statements plunged me into profound chaos. I had felt all along that they had left for good. I knew that they had not left in an ordinary sense, but I had kept that feeling in the realm of a metaphor. Although I had even voiced it to close friends, I think I never really believed it myself. In the depths of me, I had always been a rational man. But Lagorda and the Little Sisters had turned my obscure metaphors into real possibilities. Lagorda had actually transported us half a mile with the energy of her dreaming. Lagorda stood up and said that I had understood everything and that it was time for us to eat. She served us the food that she had cooked. I did not feel like eating. At the end of the meal, she stood up and came to my side. "I think it's time for you to leave," she said to me. That seemed to be a cue for the Little Sisters. They also stood up. "If you stay beyond this moment, you won't be able to leave anymore," Lagorda went on. "The nagual gave you freedom once, but you chose to stay with him. He told me that if we all survived the last contact with the Allies, I should feed all of you, make you feel good, and then say goodbye to all of you. I figure that the Little Sisters and myself have no place to go, so there is no choice for us. But you are different." The Little Sisters surrounded me and each said goodbye to me. There was a monstrous irony in that situation. I was free to leave, but I had no place to go. There was no choice for me, either. Years before Don Juan gave me a chance to back out, I stayed because already then I had no place to go. "We choose only once," he had said then. "We choose either to be warriors or to be ordinary men. A second choice does not exist. Not on this earth." And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.